This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Sam.
Okay.
Try to keep you on your toes.
Well, you know, I do what I can. It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas here.
It feels like Christmas anyway.
I know. It certainly does.
You've got your tree up. We do too now. So
yeah, we do.
First time in a while we've done it before Thanksgiving. But
well, that's apocryphal, I guess. But you know, it's
and I know a lot of people now actually do Thanksgiving trees. They do Thanksgiving decorations on their tree first, and then transition over to the Christmas decorations. So.
I'd not heard that, but
yeah,
we are staunchly Black Friday Christmas decorating types at our house, and so we've I think the only time we broke that was last year. We decided to do it a week early, but typically it's the Friday after Thanksgiving. Traditionally, is when we decorate. But
when you got a 2-year-old, they're ready, anxious for Christmas to get on with it. So,
yeah, she's been her wish has been for a Christmas tree for the past
what she wishes for
month or so. Oh yeah, no, she gets it for sure. So, we're doing another book review. So this is sort of a back to back.
Yeah.
We've just had a couple of good books that we've read recently. And this one is on reading well, and I really enjoyed. This is a book that I read quite a while ago.
I think we've shared before that we have a book club that we do, and you and your wife, my daughter, and my 2 sons, and I, and now my cousin Rob, who's president of the Canadian Seminary, is on the book club as well. And so we pick a book and work through it, and then we order in lunch and here, at least at the office, and Zoom in the others from Canada and take about an hour and a half and discuss the book. And all of you guys have at least a master's degree, and there's a lot of doctor's degrees in that room. And so we're all kind of used to book reviews and reading. And you were in an MBA program, so you didn't have to read much. You just had to count a lot. But
it was just move the beans from this pile to that pile.
But so this is, in fact, we're having later today. We're having lunch and we're going to discuss this book. So kind of had it on my mind and thought, it's not a bad book for a couple of reasons just to share on this podcast today.
Well, and it's good for me too, because it's been so long, I think, since I finished this book, and
I know. I think
I wasn't going to have a chance to look over it.
My October travel was so brutal in the fall here that we didn't really have time to schedule a lunch book club meeting. So I wasn't even home here for a lunch time for about a month and a half. So
well, the title of this book by Karen Swallow Pryor is On Reading Well, and one might ask, as a leader, why read? Like, what's all that about? Don't you just go out there and lead?
Who has time to be reading books when there's organizations to lead?
I know, there's stuff to do here.
Well, Karen Swallow Pryor is an English professor, I believe, and currently teaches at Southeastern Baptist Seminary out in North Carolina. And she does 2 things in this book, I think, that I particularly appreciate. One is she just really highlights the value of reading, and gives some encouragement, and then models that by each chapter. She basically unpacks a classic book, and they're all fiction books, which is kind of interesting too. And she models how to draw great truths and insights from great literature. And then secondly, she looks particularly at what she calls the virtues. And in the past, during the Roman era particularly, there was a great movement among the educated to promote and practice the virtues, they would call them. And those were considered the noble character traits that were considered to be, if you were a noble person, or if you were a Christian, you were a godly person. These were identified as the character traits that would most exemplify you. And so what she says, it's kind of interesting, is and of course what these people believed for centuries was that you could cultivate these. You weren't just born with these. These were virtues that you could develop over time. And of course, even deists like Benjamin Franklin were famous for every year identifying at least a certain character trait that he wanted to do better. He was a self-improved man, kind of a self-help sort of approach, but he had the basic belief that you could better yourself. And
I can tell you as a father of a 2-year-old, you're certainly not born with virtue.
You believe in the depravity of mankind.
Exactly, but even at 2, you can start to see virtues forming and improving over time.
And so she mentions a couple of things. There's 3 kinds of virtue that she's going to unpack. One she calls the Cardinal Virtues, and these are prudence, temperance, justice, and courage. And these 4 are considered to be kind of the bedrock, the foundation upon which you build other ones. And so prudence, we'll get into in a second. It's not a word that's used very much now, but you could really call it wisdom, just making good decisions in real life time. Temperance, kind of self-control, and justice, of course, just doing the right thing, and certainly in relationship to others. And then courage. And you kind of have to have courage if you're going to do some of those other things. Without courage, you can believe in a lot of things, just not have the will to actually practice them. So those 4 are what she calls cardinal virtues. And then she has some others she calls theological virtues, which are kind of ones that would come straight out of the Bible. And the 3 that she highlights are faith, hope, and love, which, of course, are 3 of the big ones there that get mentioned over and over again. And then she lists what she calls the heavenly virtues of chastity, diligence, patience, kindness, and humility. I think she lists temperance in there again too, in both categories. But she says basically these virtues, if you, in one sense, you ought to be always working to cultivate one of those. And we've talked about some of these before. Courage, certainly, I'm recognizing, especially in the culture in which we live today, to lead as a Christian, to lead with Christian values is going to require increasingly more courage.
Yeah.
And an interesting thought is, can you increase your courage? We would tend to say, well, some people just are braver than others. Some are more timid than others.
Yeah.
Is it possible to actually increase the level of courage that you practice, that you have? And how would you go about doing that? And I think this is also probably good because we're, as we get to the end of the year, when this podcast is coming out, I always like to take some time to reflect going into a new year to say, are there some areas of my character, are there some areas of my leadership that I really would like to address very, very specifically in a focused way, and not just hoping that at the end of the year I'm a better person, but saying, no, I want to have a plan. I want to have a plan to lead more courageously, more prudently. Maybe I want to have a plan to have more temperance, more self-control. And so this is what I'm going to do. And perhaps it involves reading some books that really highlight that area. Maybe it means holding myself accountable in some way. It could certainly mean setting some goals for my behavior. But we'll talk more about this at the end of the year, but we're almost there. And so I think this is a good book to just sit before you and say, what are some of those basic character traits that you want to always be bettering, always making better. And so that's kind of the twofold thing that I found some real value in with this book is, one, it just promotes reading and books, and secondly, it also promotes virtue and developing yourself as a person. So she said several things I think that are interesting. And one kind of thing that she promotes, and of course she models some of this, and so she quotes people like Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, and she's going to quote a lot of ancient writers and so on. and she kind of demonstrates just the richness of wisdom that can be found. But as she's talking about Milton, she says, because the world since the fall contains both good and evil, Milton says virtue consists of choosing good over evil. And of course, being virtuous doesn't mean that you live in you cloister yourself away from evil. Being virtuous means that you're right in the midst of an evil world, but you just make virtuous choices. And so he says, Milton distinguishes between the innocent who know no evil and the virtuous who know what evil is and elect to do good. So some people are just so protected or naive, they just don't even know that there is an evil option. And these people are innocent. They haven't done wrong, but they haven't necessarily had the opportunity either.
Yeah.
And then he says, but in one sense, the truly virtuous people are the ones who go every day into the fray of evil, and yet they choose to do the right thing, and they choose not to do the wrong thing. And so she says, what better way to learn the difference between evil and good, Milton argues, than to gain knowledge of both through reading widely. Since therefore the knowledge and survey of vice is in this world so necessary to the constituting of human virtue, and the scanning of error to the confirmation of truth, how can we more safely and with less danger scout into the regions of sin and falsity than by reading all manner of tractates and hearing all manner of reason? And this is the benefit of which may be had of books. And then Milton says, promiscuously read. And I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
But basically what Milton is saying is, and what she says, maybe I'll just quote something that she said. She says, by reading widely, voraciously, and indiscriminately, I learned spiritual lessons I never learned in church or Sunday school, as well as emotional and intellectual lessons that I would never have encountered within the realm of my lived experience. And so what she says is, there's just you don't have long enough to live to experience everything that this world has to offer. Even to come up against certain situations, you're probably never going to encounter them. You may encounter a lot, but there's just so many varied experiences you can have in life that you're probably not going to experience all those. So if you live your whole life in one country, you're not going to have a bunch of experiences that come from living abroad. If you live abroad, you're going to miss experiences you would have had if you stayed nearby where you grew up. If you have a life of difficulty, you might not experience things that come with a life of ease. And so what she says is, by reading, you expose your life to all kinds of issues, temptations, pressures, difficult decisions that you would never have faced just in the normal course of your life. And so it's interesting because a lot of times we just assume that we would always make the right choice. We would always just make the virtuous choice. But then literature provides us with some really sticky, difficult dilemmas where people get into, and all of a sudden, as we're reading it, we're thinking to ourselves, wow, I'm not even sure what the right thing is to do. Like, how do you end up doing the just thing there when no matter what you do, someone's going to get hurt?
Yeah.
How do you do the right thing where if you do one thing, you're not going to be happy, but someone else will be. And if you do another thing, you'll be happy and they won't. And so that's the great thing about literature. It poses all kinds of circumstances that cause you to have to think in ways that the normal course of your life you never would.
Especially with literature, I think it's easy, especially for leaders and people in positions of authority, or if you've got people that are depending on you. When you think about reading, I feel like it's typically some sort of a how-to book or some type of more of an analytical. Hey, here are the top traits in leadership that you need to be concerned about, and here's a way to get more out of your people, or to be more empathetic or whatever. And we so often don't think that actually you could be a better leader by reading more literature and reading more fiction.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think is often lost.
Yeah, I've seen a number of surveys of pastors where they were asked to read maybe their top 3 influential books in their life, and interestingly, on several of those surveys I saw, one of the books that came in the top 3 was The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky.
Yeah,
and that is a tome. That is a tough read. It took me about 3 attempts to finally read through all the pages of it and mark it up. And it's just tough slugging some of those Russian novelists. And of course, some of the other ones by him as well. Crime and Punishment. I've purchased. I want to read Anna Karenina. Is in some studies has lately been considered maybe the greatest novel, and so I've got that. I haven't read it yet. Because I tend to read biography, more nonfiction biographies or leadership books and so on. But I really do. I have a whole bookshelf of basically classic books that I want to get to. I've started into Tale of Two Cities and got kind of waylaid with a bunch of other reading I had to do. But especially during the holidays, I like to kind of kickstart some of that. And it's in one sense, reading great literature it can be relaxing because you're kind of swept up into another world by some of the great masters of writing.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, those writers also grapple with some of life's greatest issues that generation after generation, century after century, still challenges people to say, well, what's the right thing to do? And so, I always like to have some of those books kind of on deck. I always have one on my desk. I've got Tale of Two Cities on my desk right now that I kind of plan to read through Christmas. I'll probably start over again and just start at the beginning. Yeah. I was marking it up, reading, and then when I have a lot of books to write, I slow down with my reading. But I just think that if you're a preacher, certainly having read the classics will give you all kinds of great illustrations. Yeah. If you're a writer, a blogger, there's just such a wealth there of that you can use in a practical way, besides just being familiar with it, the issues. But one thing that I thought was interesting just about reading, she says, reading virtuously means first reading closely, being faithful to both text and context, interpreting accurately and insightfully. And then she adds, the skills of interpretation and evaluation require prudence. The skills required to read well are no great mystery. Reading well is, well, simple, if not easy. It just takes time and attention. For those who find reading difficult, she says this. She says, practice makes perfect, but pleasure makes practice more likely. So read something enjoyable. If a book is so agonizing that you avoid reading it, put it down and pick up one that brings you pleasure. Life is too short and books are too plentiful not to. She also says, read a book that challenges you. Don't just keep reading ones that are just T-ball kind of hits where it just sets everything up for you. Take some 90-mile-plus-an-hour fastball books that are going to keep you on your toes and make you think, but they're going to exercise your mind. And she says, interestingly, that the slowest readers are often the best ones. And she also encourages people to read with a pen and pencil and highlighters in hand. And she describes a good book like a good friend. They tend to do the same kind of things. They enrich your life. They bring new perspectives into your life. And so that was kind of interesting to me because a lot of those excuses, I know, Sam, you've kind of found like with audio books that's a great way for you to be exposed to that when you're driving and stuff. Like some people just they're quick readers. They can devour books really quickly. Other people it's just like running. I think it just don't have the same speed, and so then you see a 1,000-page Russian novel and you think there's just I don't have a long enough life to read that.
Yeah, certainly not the place you would want to start your literature career is with any of the Russian tomes like that.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what, you've arrived if you can knock off a War and Peace or something like that. You realize, wow, I've that's a sense of accomplishment. But
oh, certainly. I mean, they should hand out plaques when that was finished. Well, let's maybe take a quick break here, and we'll pick up in just a few minutes.
Hello, I'm Richard Blackaby, and I'm president of Blackaby Ministries International. On behalf of my parents and the whole Blackaby team, I want to just thank you for your friendship, your support, your prayers for our ministry. These have been challenging times, and there's been all kinds of difficulties and challenges and hurdles to overcome that churches and individuals and ministries have never had to face before. But I'm reminded of what Paul said in Philippians, where he said, I give thanks to my God for every remembrance of you, always praying with joy for all of you in my every prayer because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. And that's certainly my heart as well, to thank you for your partnership with us. And I wanted just to let you know, especially as we come to the end of this year, that a wonderful friend of our ministry just believes so much in what God is doing that he has offered a $100,000 matching gift to our ministry, which means that anyone who gives a donation to our ministry from this point onward through the end of the year, he'll match it up to $100,000. So if you were thinking of giving us $100,000, this is the time to do it, because it will be completely doubled by this wonderful donor. But seriously, we just want to encourage you that if the Lord has placed us on your heart, this is a great time to do that, because it will release the matching amount of money. And we just have a conviction here at Blackaby Ministries that God is doing some amazing things right now. Everywhere I go and speak, there just seems to be a hunger and a great response. And so we are looking forward to the year ahead and what God will do. And if you can help in matching this very special gift, it will enable us to be fully prepared to respond to everything God will ask us to do. So thank you for all that you've done, and we look forward to serving with you, partnering with you in the year ahead.
Well, I really love that quote, Richard, that you said from Karen, the one about reading not being hard, that it's just all it takes is time and attention. And of course, the thing that came to my mind was that nobody takes time or gives attention to much anymore these days. And we've talked about it before, but a lot of that's just you're on your phone. Everything now is geared to you not having time or attention. And so what a great reminder and challenge to us to actually take time and attention and focus on reading. Yeah. And so maybe just in the last few minutes that we have here, what were some other insights that you got out of this book?
I might just mention too, Sam, and I've said this before as well, but I encourage people to read with a pen in hand. And what I tend to do is I underline statements that really speak to me, or I'll put an asterisk beside it or even a Q beside it if I think it's a great quote that I might want to use somewhere. And just the act of doing that for me keeps me focused. If I'm just kind of just reading page by page, it's easy to get distracted. If you're reading every line to see, is that something I could reference in a tweet somewhere, or I could use in a sermon or in a book, or then all of a sudden you're paying a lot more attention. And so I just read more carefully if I've got a pen in my hand. Now it kind of devalues the book if you're thinking about reselling it later, but
who would ever do that?
Why would you give it if you've mastered a 1,000-page Russian novel? I'm keeping that on a shelf so people know what I've read. So that has certainly helped me. But a couple things just to mention. For instance, temperance is an interesting one, especially coming out of Thanksgiving and going into Christmas. Temperance maybe is not a bad one. It's not necessarily a popular one, but it says one can attain the virtue of temperance when one's appetites have been shaped such that one's desires are in proper order and proportion. And she makes an interesting point that the United States has 3.1% of all the world's children but 40% of all of the world's toys.
Man, I believe that.
I thought that was interesting. Yeah, just so we spoil ourselves. We're affluent, and I don't think it's wrong necessarily to have toys, but what temperance says is, but what's reasonable? What at what limit? And we have to have these talks sometimes with my wife because she loves to give gifts, and even if they're not necessary, even if they're in extra overabundance, it's like, I know that this warms your heart to give gifts, but like it's not necessarily helpful, and we don't really need to spend that much money. We've given gifts. Like, I always have to say, just draw the line. Like, that's enough. But, then when it comes to eating, she has to say that to me and say, I know that tastes good and every bite just is delightful, but at a certain point, you got to draw the line and say, that's enough. Like, you don't need any more. At this point, it's just gluttony. And I've often thought, as a preacher myself, that I've seen some very rotund preachers that delight in preaching about other sins. And it's obvious from their girth that they have their own sin that they struggle with, and that's temperance. It's just saying, when have I eaten enough? When have I drunk enough? And so I think, there's something, I think, very spiritual about being in control of your body, of your habits. And part of what it just says is that rather than you being, that we sometimes think of temperance as, well, it just means I can't do certain things. It means I have to, I can't eat all the pie or drink all the sweet iced tea I want to drink. But he says, or she says, temperance is actually liberating because it allows us to be masters of our pleasures instead of becoming its slaves. And I think that there certainly are some folks that are slaves to their pleasures, slaves to their eating, slaves to their appetites, and they just can't. They just can't even hardly resist it. It's just they know they're going to capitulate, and so temperance says, no, I'm in control. I can stop at a certain point. I can make healthy choices, and so of course every New Year's I think there's a lot of resolutions related in some ways to temperance because we're always struggling in that area, and she talks about a few others like courage, and it's also interesting just where she gets some of this from. Like she takes this from the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and it's quite interesting just to see how she unpacks some of these classic books and sees that, like with Huckleberry Finn, that he's not educated, and in many ways he's quite simple, and yet she sees in him great courage. By the way, it's interesting, the temperance one she gets from The Great Gatsby, that's just opulent and extravagant, and yet, but at the same time, she sees a lack of temperance as a sign of a troubled soul as well, and trying to satisfy with physical things what's missing maybe in our soul. And so that's interesting. And faith, she talks about, just says, a faith that never feels challenged is most likely dead. That was an interesting quote. If you never feel it challenged, where you've got to study and pray and think and go to the Bible and carefully think through it, because faith, it's fine if you are just live at church all week long, but as soon as you go to work, as soon as you go out into the world, your faith's going to be challenged by a circumstance or a person, a critic, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, she says. And so even when you read books that I think challenge your fundamental beliefs, even read a book by an atheist, that and we've done that in our book club, where we've read a book by a very devout atheist, and they fired their best shots at our faith, and we kind of felt as a book club we need to know what are the most devastating critiques that atheists have toward our beliefs, and as we looked at them, not trying to be just dismissive, but say, what are they saying? And then, is this valid? Are they even accurately representing the faith? A lot of times they pull up a straw man.
Most times, I would say.
They look at the Middle Ages or something and try to say, well, look, Christians are all like this. And to say, or they just misrepresent what the Bible teaches. And so to weed all that out and say, is there a vulnerable part, and maybe a place where we just have to believe and not necessarily have all the answers? And so that was interesting, and I think it just kind of encourages us as well, just to say, well, read some things that you don't agree with. Like, read some things that make you mad. That atheist book, there was a few times where I just had to put it down for a second and say, well, this guy, he says he's being scientific, and then he misrepresents the facts. He doesn't, if he's really a devout atheist, he shouldn't be afraid to just take Christianity on by what it actually says, and what the Bible says. And not just try to misrepresent it, because then it's easier to discredit. And so she talks about a lot of different things. She talks about love and so on, and there's some very very thought-provoking kind of books that she and pictures she pulls out of literature of people that that, for instance, love, where they weren't loving toward others, and then they created a world that doesn't have love in it, and then they reap what they've sown.
Yeah.
And it's actually a horrific life to live in an unloving life. But and so, of course, you don't want to try that out in real life. It's better to read about a classic portrayal of someone who lived a loveless life and then see what it looks like. And so, lots of great statements in here that just make you think. There's a lot of places that you kind of underline, like chastity. C.S. Lewis said it's the most unpopular of all the Christian values. Augustine, when he was young, said, "Give me chastity and continence, but not yet." And there's some interesting things, even like Pilgrim's Progress. There's as they use that for sloth, and she says an excess of effort is also a vice, which is kind of interesting. You wouldn't think of that as working too hard or trying too hard, but there's just a lot of interesting statements. It talks about patience, and sometimes, for instance, you can deal with an issue of patience, like when you put up with someone and you're patient. Can that be a vice? Is there a certain point where you don't need to be patient anymore? You need to be impatient with the way someone's treating you.
Yeah.
If you just constantly just take abuse, or you take wrongdoing, is there a point where patience isn't the right thing to practice? And when is it? And so,
well, and that idea that the virtue is sort of in that, what is it, the golden mean or whatever, where it's the virtuous thing is not the extremes of either side. It's finding that the sort of that middle path, that you're not overly patient and you're not overly impatient.
Yeah, and that's what this word prudence really means. It's properly determining what is what extent should I have of patience and so on, and in what circumstance, and are there times when I shouldn't be patient? Should I have a short fuse on certain things, and should I have a long-standing, long-suffering, patient sort of attitude toward others? And so, if you're dealing with a 2-year-old, you probably need a lot of patience.
You do,
but
I'll tell you that for sure.
But sometimes when you're dealing with a colleague who continually fails to do what they said, how much patience do you show? And so there's a lot of issues, of course, tied up into all of this that I think that literature brings to the forefront. And there are times where maybe a heroine in a novel just keeps putting up with all kinds of grief and abuse, and you're getting all upset even as you read it, saying, "Don't take that anymore. Fight back for yourself, stand up for yourself." And you realize, even as you read it, that there's just something not right about this. I mean, this person's noble in one sense, because they just keep on having a sweet spirit even when they're being treated so terribly. And then other times you think, but could it be that maybe they lack courage? If they had more courage, would they stand up for themselves? And so, of course, that's why all these virtues have to also fit together.
Right.
Courage and patience and love and so on. There's a certain amount of each of those that you need to demonstrate in every encounter you have with someone. And if you get any of those out of proportion, then all of a sudden maybe you're being too patient, or maybe you're being too courageous. Sometimes, courageous, there's just a fine line between that and foolishness, where you were just foolhardy. So anyway, it's a great way to read through, and I certainly would encourage our listeners, pick up at least one classic book, maybe over Christmas, that will just put you up against some of the greatest writing, some of the greatest thinking in history, and just get your life up next to that. I'll tell you, I last night I was kind of perusing my library, trying to decide which books I wanted to read next, and I've got a number I haven't read yet that I fully intend to. And especially as my travel really picks up and I'm on airplanes, that's always a good time for me just to choose which book will accompany me on this next trip. And as I sit there waiting for a flight to go or on the airplane, and don't squander opportunities. Maybe during the holidays, if you're home a little more. I found just even the last hour or so before I go to bed, instead of watching the news and it making you mad, why don't you pull out a classic book every evening before bed? I think you and Carrie do that often.
Yeah.
Used to, and
no, we still do, and it's a great way to end your day.
If you fill your mind with great thoughts, great issues, your mind still might be racing a bit when you go to sleep, but at least it's dealing with issues that matter, that have challenged humanity for generations.
Yeah, and if you struggle to know what classic literature to pick up, I would suggest starting with On Reading Well, because she goes through a great list of classic novels that, and she, because I've read several of the ones that she sort of unpacks, and even her unpacking them, she pulls out so much of these novels that I just completely missed or just was not aware of, and so.
And that's what a good English teacher needs to do.
Exactly. It reminded me of being in English class and just realizing the value of having a good teacher. So don't
just read a book and just see it simply as a story. It could be a good story, entertaining story, but don't miss the deeper threads and issues that great writers always weave into it. There's always various levels that you can read a book at, and so that she'll help you understand how to read at a deeper level, where there's a lot of gold in these books, but you got to get below the surface to find it. Yeah.
Well, as always, we'll leave a link to this in our show notes, and until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.